Chapter 12 deals with the family. And perhaps the overriding theme for Chapter 12 is to question, what does family mean? If you look at the conception of family that arose during the 1950s, it was, to use the phrase, a nuclear family, the father and mother and at least 2 children in a home. What made that unusual is that historically that was not that common. Among other things, the idea that you would have people living in a home was something more commonly seen after World War II. You also saw during a period of roughly 1955 to 1970 that wages were high enough so that there would only be one wage earner in the family, allowing the mother typically to remain at home and to raise children. That was a time that has been viewed subsequently with a measure of nostalgia, implying that perhaps something was lost during that period of time, when in fact it fails to take into account that the nostalgia might be based in a sense of ideology, that it is a construct. This idea of traditional family was dominant, it was normative, and it was mythical. Consider the mechanisms that bring about the creation of family. Understand that where family often arises out of marriage, that even restrictions on marriage have historically existed. In 1967, for example, the United States Supreme Court said that bans against so-called interracial marriages could no longer stand because they violated the equal protection provisions of the 14th Amendment. Different kinds of marriages could include endogamy, which means marriage within one's social group or caste, if you want to look at it, with exogamy being married outside of one's group. When we have only 2 people in a marriage, that would be called monogamy. If you have at least one more spouse, you would have polygamy instead of just 2. There would be 3 adults, and typically that would involve 1 man and 2 women, but you could also have polyandry, where you would have 1 woman and 2 men. These distinctions may not necessarily have been preserved or kept. It's certainly not been traditional in this country to have those kinds of marriages. For example, as a condition for joining the United States, the state of Utah had to give up the practice legally of polyandry and polygamy, even though that was a tenet of the faith that many people in Utah shared, membership in the Church of the Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormonism. There is apparently some reason to think that the concept of family is universal, that some studies show that even amongst isolated groups of people, such as the indigenous peoples of Australia, reaffirm that family plays a critical role. What you may see today is family as a functional necessity in a modern industrial society that, as this conception from Talcott Parsons puts it, it seems necessary for people to be able to function in an industrialized society. What you expect when you look at family in the Western world today, you will see them as a kin network, which roughly accounts for or relates to the idea of people related by blood rather than say necessarily by marriage. Also note that there started to be changes on what constitutes family, to the point that we will have families arising even though they may not be sanctioned as a matter of law, that there would be cohabitation, although enforcement of the laws against this are very rare. You're starting to see also a decline in the birth rate since roughly the mid to late 1990s, and you've started to see a rise in so-called single-parent families, which had traditionally been due to death, but now may be more the consequence of divorce, or in some cases where the parents have not married. Where does the drawing line exist between what the public can say or demand of marriage and what privately happens? Well, we've already talked about kin networks, which talk about relationships related by blood, and the strength of those ties may reinforce and help to support the creation of families. You could see even historical forms of family going back to the 19th century, and these conceived of families as a sort of economic enterprise where every member of the family had something to contribute in some fashion. What you started to see after some of the wars that you saw in the 19th and 20th centuries is more of a division of labor based on gender. You would see one metaphor as describing this as the difference between grapevine forms to beanpole families. So instead of seeing a larger network, as you might see with grapevines, the beanpole concept had to do with a family growing up straight with no connectedness to other similar families. You started to see also in early modern families the so-called cult of domesticity, the idea that a woman's value or her worth arose in the fulfillment of her domestic responsibilities and in child rearing. After World War II, you started to see greater economic security, but it was still a time for struggles of women and people who identified as black dealing with racism. Real wages were high enough to allow to keep a spouse at home, but this was only for a discrete period of time, and roughly coinciding with the 1973 so-called oil shock, when we had a sudden jolt to the economy. We saw that the idea of having one spouse at home had become an economic luxury that few people could afford. That change has also led to a number of other consequences in a revolution about what it means for family and work. You may see that the financial outcomes of sons and daughters may differ depending on mother's employment. The mother may serve as a role model, for example, communicating to children the way in which doing work was the norm or typical behavior. You also started to see gender differences arising where girls may end up taking different career paths than what their mothers had taken. Still, another perspective on family would be the so-called feminist perspective, where the family would be seen as a gender factory, assigning certain roles and reinforcing them both in the public and in the private spheres. Family becomes a place where gender is done. But when you started to see books such as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, you're starting to see challenges to the idea that a woman's value lay in her domesticity, that the so-called cult of domesticity prevailed. Problems arose with family, especially when it comes down to domestic abuse, that it is widespread, that the author offers up statistics suggesting that anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of all women will experience domestic violence, and that men are more likely by 2.5 times to kill an intimate partner than women. But that's only one form of familial abuse. You could certainly see child abuse and elder abuse, the former being so distinct or frequent as to prompt a societal reaction to it, and with any luck to be able to prevent such abuse from befalling the defenseless like children. Think too about family from the idea of chores and how effectively a woman would need to work 2 jobs, that her second shift job, whatever her other work is, would be in maintaining the family. such as cooking meals, preparing laundry, caring for children such as their bathing, reading bedtime stories and the like. While that may no longer be the norm in many marriages, it's still predominantly the case that at least what constitutes men helping out may not necessarily create an equal distribution of obligations or responsibilities. An interesting perspective on the issue of chores is to see that there's a more egalitarian distribution of responsibilities with so-called gay or lesbian couples. So perhaps the idea of different roles requires opposite gender partners. Maybe not. The second shift requires women to do an extraordinary amount of work, as well as serving as a parent and a partner, and to have to engage in the process of climbing a career ladder. It could even face the deterring effect of the fact that a woman may end up succeeding by some measures, such as income, over that of the husband, and therefore making the woman wear the pants in the family. An archaic phrase that suggested that the woman had enough money that she required the pockets that you would need with a pair of pants, where historically women would be wearing dresses, or at least within the previous century in this country, it was more common for women to wear dresses and to keep the money, which would be relatively small, in an object such as a purse. What's going on with American families today? Look at inequality and the way in which it falls to differing degrees upon American families. That with African American families, we have not merely the woman having her regular shift and a second shift, but potentially a third shift, because she may end up being the primary breadwinner or even the only breadwinner. Some suggested that, in fact, that was corrosive to the role of men in marriages amongst African American families. That a counter-argument suggested that this was a function of racial oppression and poverty, rather than necessarily due to some act of defiance on the part of black women. It may be something that has arisen out of necessity when you look at the frequency with which black men end up behind bars. It may fail to take into account the fact that family will differ in definition, even though we have the notion of a white family being the de facto norm. May there be cultural differences that could also account for this, something that might be more pronounced with so-called Latino families. But the thing with the Latino designation is that it would encompass a wide range of people whose commonality may be in terms of sharing a language, like Spanish or Portuguese. That Latino families may very well end up being divided so that one or both of the partners in marriage works in this country and returns money to their home country in the form of remittances, which themselves have become so large as to be part of the economies in certain countries. Even then, that may not be enough. You may end up finding that some families end up being flat broke, that single mothers in poverty have a very tough struggle, that when you look at the social experiment of Barbara Ehrenreich in her book Being Nickeled and Dimed to Death, was that it wasn't possible to survive on minimum wage income. And that was just for one person. That in fact, that if we have somebody who ends up trying to support a family and is getting state aid, even then there's a certain hostility there, an expectation that at some point in time she won't be able to do it. The irony being, of course, that the president who signs this into law himself was raised in a single parent household where that parent received state aid. that president talked about the ending of welfare as we knew it, but the welfare trap that came about with now the time limitations on welfare meant that compelling single parents to work would create new demands upon them for child care, and that it would be very difficult to be able to find the quality of work that would allow them to pay for that. So what you end up doing is taking the single parent out of the household even more, adding on a second job or a third job to be able to support a family. The phenomena that relate to gender roles in families may start at a very early age, that there may be a pecking order that arises in childhood. This is something that was historically also recognized in the field of psychology, where one form of psychology, Adlerian psychology, emphasized the importance of birth order in terms of what kinds of positions the children would ultimately adopt when they got involved in marriages. Where does that leave marriage and families? Well, unfortunately, divorce will become still a common factor in family life. The consequences of divorce may be far-reaching. They may go beyond merely limiting future earnings or changing socioeconomic status, but may have an impact on a child's educational attainment, may end up altering the social fabric. The irony is that high divorce rates seem to exist in states which might characterize themselves as conservative, but certainly more religious than in other states, even though for many religions the idea of divorce may be the opposite of what the faith's views on so-called traditional families are. You might see more of a rise of blended families. Even though divorce may end up one marriage, it doesn't prevent either partner from necessarily remarrying, and those blended families themselves are going to have still greater complexities added than what you might expect with a more traditional family. We've started to see within the last decade or so the rise of so-called gay marriage, which is slowly being spread throughout the country. The number of states, I think, is now up to, if not 13, at least 14 states where they're legally recognized. The old intermediate arrangement of civil unions seems to have fallen by the wayside. Part of the arguments against civil unions was that they had the look and feel of marriage but not the title. And so in the arguments that were presented to the U.S. Supreme Court that led to the striking down of the federal law recognizing only marriages as consisting of a man and a woman, one Supreme Court justice characterized a civil union as a skim milk marriage, something that was not fully there, and certainly was a consideration for why the domestic, the DOMA law was struck down by the court, that it was seen as really a second-class status for which there was no valid reason to create the second class. You're starting to see some states that recognize domestic partnerships, which might mean that there are legally recognized unions, but not anywhere near the same rights as existed with the civil union. You might also see so-called multiracial families, that while those were illegal at one point in time historically, even in 1967 when they were struck down, it was only the case in 16 states that you had so-called anti-miscegenation laws forbidding this. You're starting to see this trend to the extent that, at least by statistics provided in 2008, nearly 15% of the couples in America would be characterized as interracial. So that's a brief overview on the material in Chapter 12.